Hi, on today's video I will be making some cutting boards and telling you why the cutting board is the perfect project as a gift. But before we get on why cutting boards are the perfect gift, we'll need to do some prep work to get this work started. On my cutting boards I will be using some walnut, cherry and maple to have some contrasting stripes on the boards. The main color on my boards will be walnut, and that's why the board is a bit longer than the two others, and I will be rough cutting it to size to make it a bit more easier to join and plane it down. And I will be making 3 more or less identical cutting boards at the same time because it makes it a bit faster to do multiple ones rather than just doing one at a time. I will also be adding choice grooves to the boards, and for that I will show you how to make an easy jig to make the grooves. Once I had the boards planed down, it was time to start cutting the pieces for the boards. To make the boards look interesting, I will be cutting the boards into different widths, and then I can have different width stripes on the cutting boards. Before I started making the cuts, I already had an idea on how I would want the cutting boards to look like, but now that I had all the pieces cut, it was the first time I could actually see how they would look in real life. And I think that having the 3 different species is a really nice touch because it adds nice visual contrast to the board with different colors. Originally, I was thinking that I would use Paduk instead of cherry, but then I learned that Paduk has a tendency to leak color on the lighter woods, so that could be an issue in long term with the maple next to that. But I think cherry was a nice choice for the third wood because it is a bit different in color compared to the 2 others. And in the beginning of the video I told that I would be telling you why I think the cutting boards are the perfect gift to give as a woodworker. But before we get into that, I would like to ask you that if you are enjoying the video, please leave it a like, and if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe to the channel as well. So, why do I think the cutting boards are the perfect gift to give as a woodworker? First of all, there are a lot of people who are using plastic cutting boards, and those are just awful to you because when you chop down anything on the board, you will get small pieces of plastic with each cut into your food that you are cutting. And at least I would prefer having small pieces of wood which is organic rather than plastic which isn't. And if you already have a wooden cutting board, I would say that it's more than likely that it's from somewhere like IKEA or a dollar store or something like that. And there's nothing wrong with those. They are definitely better than the plastic ones, but they don't usually last that long. They either start cupping and twisting or you get cracks into them. And more often than not, they are quite thin, less than an inch, about 2 centimeters or something like that, so they don't last that long due to that either. And more often than not, they are usually from a bit softer and cheaper woods, and they are not visually that nice to look at as they usually have just one singular color on them. So, why you should then give cutting boards to others if you make them yourself? First of all, they are way better for you than the plastic ones. Then they are much nicer looking and long lasting than the shop bought ones. And I think that people will appreciate that you've made something yourself rather than just buying it from a store or giving them a gift card or something else. And cutting boards are fairly simple to make. You can of course make super difficult end grain ones, but making these edge grain stripe ones are rather simple and quick to make. So it's not that you would be putting hundreds of hours on custom made cabinet or that much on the materials either, and you can affect the material costs quite a lot by the way you choose the wood species. And most importantly, cutting boards are useful gifts because most of the people cut something on daily basis, so there's always need for one. Now that we had the boards glued up, I cut them to size and I used a neat little trick by adding some painter's tape on where I would do the cut to reduce any tear out. Then it was time to do some sanding before I would start adding the joist grooves and the roundovers to the boards. And speaking of the joist grooves, it's time to show you how to make the jig for those. For the jig, I'm using some 18mm 3/4 of an inch plywood. You will also need some threaded inserts and some thumb screws. First, I started by cutting 4 pieces that are about 8 cm 3 inches wide and 60 cm 2 feet long. The next step is to route out a channel about 2 cm or 1 inch from one of the edges. This allows you to use the jig with different sized cutting boards. And the groove that you make should be the same width as the thumb screws you would be using. Once all the grooves were cut, then it was time to mark down where I would need to drill a hole on each piece for the threaded insert. And you need to make the hole on the opposing end of where your groove is cut. And to make the hole, I'm just using the doweling jig because that's an easy way to get it centered on the piece. Then, once you have the holes, you just insert the threaded insert, and then you can assemble the whole thing with the thumb screws. I'm also adding a washer with the thumb screw, but you can do it without them. Then you just assemble the whole thing with the thumb screws, and then we are pretty much done. I will also be adding the spacers in between the jig and the cutting board, so I could have the joist grooves routed out a bit closer to the edge, as if I wouldn't have these, the joist groove would be quite center on the board, and that doesn't really make any sense. Once you have the spacers in, you just tighten the jig around the board and then you are good to go. Then you just push the router against your jig and route out the joist groove. I would say you should do this in a couple of passes if you are making a bit deeper joist grooves rather than doing it with single pass. And like I did here, as I'm not using any dust collection as the hose would be in the way, you should have some protection to not inhale all the dust from the router. Then, as these boards are quite thick and heavy, I thought that I'd add some handle to the ends. And here I'm marking where to stop the router, and then just using the router with an edge guide and routing out a handle on the ends. And here again, doing it in a couple of passes so I can make it deep enough safely. Once all those steps were done, there was one more thing to route out on the boards, and that was adding a roundover edge profile on all the corners. I think this both adds a nice touch to the board, but also makes it a bit long lasting as the edges have a profile rather than the hard edge that could split. I will be also adding some rubber feeds on the board to make it that it stays on its place a bit more easily, and I think it adds a bit more premium touch to the board as well. So I'm marking out in all the corners where I would be drilling some pilot holes. Before I can add the finish, there's a couple more things I need to do. First one being final round of sanding, and before that I'm doing a water bob to make sure that I can have them as smooth as I can. Then, once I have everything sanded down, it's time to add my maker's mark to the bottom of the boards. This is also another small, nice detail to add on the boards, and I think it's better to add on the bottom because on the top there will be knives cutting through it, so the mark could get ruined during the time, and I don't either like the visual look of it on the top either. And adding a splash of water on the spot where I will do the mark prevents any burning on the outer edges. Then it's time to add the finish to the boards. I'm using a self-made finish on these, which is just a mix of linseed oil and beeswax. I think the ratio is 3 parts of oil to 1 part of beeswax. And this is a nice finish on the cutting boards because it is food safe as it is a food product, and you can easily reapply it whenever the boards get dry because you wash them in water, so then you just rub more whenever you want. And here you can see how the colors pop after the finish when you compare it to the board without any finish. Then the one last thing to do is to add the feet to the bottom where we drilled the pilot holes earlier, and after that the project is done. And even though I said that these are the perfect gift to give someone, I also made one for ourselves, and we will be giving 2 of these away for some of our relatives. And if you made it this far onto the video, thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.